She was left alone on the platform until the rancher's kindness made her his forever. The train screeched as it slowed to a halt, steam curling into the late afternoon air. The platform of the small Wyoming station creaked beneath the weight of boots as townsfolk gathered to meet passengers or collect freight. Margaret Hayes clutched her carpetbag tightly against her chest, her gloved hands damp with sweat despite the dry wind that swept dust along the wooden planks. The letter in her pocket had told her he would be here, the man who had written of wide skies and honest work, of needing a wife to help raise a household. She stepped down carefully, her dress brushing against her ankles, her heart pounding with every glance cast in her direction. The people waiting studied her in silence at first, then with whispers that grew louder the longer she stood alone. A man muttered something under his breath, and another chuckled. A woman covered her mouth with her hand, whispering to her companion, and Margaret felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She was not thin or graceful like the women in the photographs she had seen in shop windows back east. She was broad-shouldered, her figure full, her face round. She knew how she looked, had known all her life what people saw first, but it had never cut as deep as it did here, alone on the platform with no hand reaching for hers. She searched every face, her eyes darting from one man to another, hoping one would step forward, would lift his hat and say her name. No one did. A boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing, and she hushed him sharply. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat dry, and clutched the letter tighter inside her pocket. Perhaps she had misread. Perhaps the name of the town was wrong. Perhaps the train had stopped in the wrong place, or worse, perhaps the man who had written to her had changed his mind and never intended to meet her at all. A burst of laughter from the far end of the platform stung her ears. She turned her face away, trying not to let them see the shine of tears forming in her eyes. Her boots felt heavy as she shifted her weight, uncertain whether to walk toward the general store, to wait longer, or to turn back and plead with the conductor for guidance. The train hissed once more, then with a groan began to pull forward, its wheels grinding against the iron tracks. Her last chance at a friendly arrival was vanishing with the smoke. For a long moment she stood frozen, dust gathering at the hem of her dress. Then she lifted her chin, forcing her back straight, though her heart trembled inside her chest. If no one came, she would not give the town the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. Still, as the last car rolled out of sight, the emptiness of the platform told her the truth she feared. She had come all this way for a greeting that never came, and now she was alone in a place that had not expected her at all. The platform had nearly emptied when Margaret shifted her bag to her other hand and tried to steady her breathing. The few remaining townsfolk glanced her way now and then, some with curiosity, others with pity, but no one stepped forward. The ache in her chest grew heavier with each passing minute. She had crossed miles of country on nothing but faith and a smudged letter, and now it seemed she had been forgotten. Her legs felt weak as she moved toward the end of the platform, unsure where she might go in a town that looked more dust than welcome. A voice stopped her. "Ma'am." She turned quickly, startled, and found a tall man standing a few feet away. His hat was pulled low, his coat worn from hard use, his boots caked with dirt. He was not young, but his frame was strong, his eyes gray and steady beneath the brim of his hat. He did not look at her the way the others had. He did not smirk or whisper. He simply waited as though what he had to say mattered. "You waiting on someone?" he asked. Margaret's throat tightened, but she forced her voice steady. "I was," she said, "though I fear I may be in the wrong place." He studied her a moment, his expression unreadable. "This is Cheyenne Crossing," he said at last. "Not a place where trains linger long." Margaret pulled the folded letter from her pocket, her fingers trembling. "I was to meet a man here," she explained, her words catching, but no one came. The man nodded slowly, glancing at the letter but not pressing her to show it. His gaze lifted back to her face, calm and measured. "Well," he said, "the trains won't be back through till morning. The hotel closed last winter. Only roof nearby is mine." He paused, his voice steady. "You're welcome to it if you've nowhere else to stay." Margaret blinked, her heart stuttering. She searched his face for mockery, for some hidden cruelty, but found none. Still, doubt pressed at her. I wouldn't want to be a burden, she said softly. He shook his head once. My boy won't rest if I leave you standing here. Better you come along. As if on cue, a small figure appeared from behind the man's coat. A boy of perhaps 7 years, his dark hair tousled, his eyes curious. He looked up at Margaret with open wonder, then tugged at his father's sleeve. She looks lost, Papa. The man gave a faint nod. That she does. He tipped his hat slightly. Name's Caleb Dyer. This here's Thomas. Margaret swallowed, clutching her bag tighter. Margaret Hayes, she said, her voice faint. Caleb inclined his head, then turned toward the waiting wagon hitched nearby. Come on, Miss Hayes, he said simply. Ain't fancy, but it's dry. The boy grinned and hopped onto the wagon seat, already reaching back as though expecting her to follow. Margaret hesitated only a moment longer before stepping down from the platform. The train whistle echoed faintly in the distance, leaving behind silence and dust. She climbed onto the wagon seat, her skirts brushing against the rough wood. Caleb clicked the reins, and the horse started forward. The town shrank behind them, and though her heart still trembled with fear, the quiet offer of shelter was the first kindness she had been shown since her journey began. The wagon jolted as it left the station behind, the wheels crunching over ruts carved into the hard earth. Margaret sat stiffly on the wooden seat, her hands folded tight around the handle of her carpetbag. Beside her, Caleb held the reins loosely, his eyes fixed ahead, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. The silence between them was not cruel, only heavy, as if words would be too much against the endless stretch of land that surrounded them. The boy, Thomas, fidgeted beside his father, his small boots dangling over the edge of the seat. His eyes, curious and wide, darted often toward Margaret, as though he could not quite puzzle out who she was, or why she had come. The sky was painted with streaks of red and gold, the last breath of the sun before night. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint smell of sagebrush and the dry dust stirred up by the horse's hooves. Margaret tried to steady her breathing, tried to remind herself that this was only for a night, perhaps 2, until another train came through. Still, each time she glanced at the boy's eager face, something in her chest softened in spite of her unease. Thomas leaned forward suddenly, his elbows on his knees, his voice breaking the quiet. Are you going to be my new mama? He asked, the words clear and bold in the fading light. Margaret's breath caught, and her eyes flew to Caleb, whose hands tightened on the reins. The horse snorted, as if sensing the shift. Caleb's voice came low, steady but sharp at the edges. Thomas, that is not a thing you ask of a lady you just met. The boy blinked up at him, confused, then looked back at Margaret, his face earnest. But she looks like she could be. She is kind, I can tell. Margaret's cheeks burned, her heart stumbling, as if she had tripped on uneven ground. She opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came. Her lips trembled, and she pressed them together quickly. She wanted to tell him no, to set the boundary firm, but the child's eyes held such longing it made her chest ache. Caleb cleared his throat, his voice gentler this time. Miss Hayes is our guest, Thomas. She is here because she needed a place to stay. That is all. Thomas nodded slowly, though disappointment lingered in his eyes. He turned back toward the horizon, quiet for the first time since they had left the station. Margaret looked down at her carpetbag, her fingers tightening around the handle until they ached. They rode on, the silence deeper now, filled only by the creak of the wagon and the soft thud of hooves. Margaret's mind whirled. She had been called many things in her life, but never mother. The word hung in the air long after Thomas had stopped speaking, heavier than the bag in her lap, heavier than the loneliness she had carried all the way from Boston. As they neared the outline of the ranch house, its windows faintly lit against the darkening sky, Margaret stole a glance at Caleb. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed ahead, but there was no anger there, only something guarded, something she could not yet name. She looked back at Thomas, who had dozed against his father's arm, his small face soft with trust. A question still lingered in her chest, a question that frightened her as much as it warmed her. What if the child's mistake was not a mistake at all, but a truth waiting to be lived? The wagon creaked to a stop in front of a low house, patched with weathered boards, its roof sloping under the weight of years. Beyond it stretched a barn leaning slightly against the wind, and a corral where a single horse shifted in the moonlight. Margaret stepped down carefully, her boots sinking into the dust, her carpetbag heavy in her hand. The air smelled of dry grass and smoke from a chimney that gave only a thin curl into the night. Caleb lifted Thomas from the seat, the boy blinking drowsily, his head resting on his father's shoulder. For a moment, Margaret stood uncertain, her heart hammering in the quiet. This was not the grand life her mother had once described for her, nor the promise of love painted in the letter she had carried. It was rough and plain, but it was real, and something about its stillness unnerved her. Inside the house, the air was warmer, carrying the scent of firewood and old pine. The room was small, with a rough table at the center, 3 chairs around it, and a hearth glowing with orange coals. A shelf near the wall held jars of beans and flour sacks, and on the mantel rested a single framed photograph, the edges faded from sunlight. Margaret's eyes lingered on the picture, a woman with soft features holding a child that must have been Thomas when he was still an infant. Caleb set his son gently on a cot in the corner, covering him with a patched quilt. The boy curled close to his pillow, already slipping into sleep. Margaret clasped her hands in front of her, her voice barely above a whisper. "You have a fine home." Caleb glanced around, his expression unreadable. "It is what it is," he said. He took off his hat and set it on the table, then poured her a cup of water from a tin pitcher. She accepted it gratefully, though her hands trembled as she lifted it. The silence stretched long, broken only by the crackle of the fire. She tried to think of something to say, but every word felt foolish. She was a stranger here, sitting in the quiet house of a man she had met only an hour ago. Caleb leaned against the wall, arms folded, his gaze fixed on the flames. He did not fidget, did not try to fill the quiet with needless talk. He seemed content to let the silence stand, and the longer it lasted, the heavier it grew around Margaret. At last he spoke, his tone even. "You can take the room at the back. It is not much, but it will keep the cold off." Margaret nodded quickly, setting the cup down. "Thank you." Her voice cracked with the words, and she flushed with embarrassment. He did not seem to notice. He only gave a small nod, then moved to stoke the fire. Margaret carried her bag down the narrow hallway to the little room he had given her. The bed was plain, the blanket coarse, the window cracked with dust at its edges. She set her bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the mattress, her shoulders sagging. The silence of the house pressed around her. It was not cruel, not unkind, but it carried a weight she could feel deep in her chest. A house still mourning, a man still guarded, and a child still praying for a mother. She lay down at last, her eyes stinging with unshed tears, and listened to the wind against the boards. It was a house of silence, but she wondered if it might one day have room for her voice. The morning broke pale and cool, the first light of dawn slipping through the cracks of the shutters. Margaret woke early, her body still heavy from the long journey, but she pushed herself from the small bed and straightened her dress. She wanted to show Caleb she was not idle, that she could be useful even if this was not truly her home. In the kitchen she found a tin of flour, a crock of lard, and a small bundle of yeast. She had seen bread made many times, though never with her own hands. Still, she told herself, it could not be so difficult. She rolled up her sleeves and set to work, humming faintly to steady her nerves. The flour puffed into the air like smoke, dusting the front of her dress. She mixed too much water at first, then too little, her fingers sticking in the heavy lump. By the time the dough was shaped, her cheeks burned with effort, and the table was a mess of powder. She set the loaf into the iron stove, praying quietly that it would rise golden and soft. Thomas stumbled into the room, his hair tousled, his small fists rubbing sleep from his eyes. He blinked at her, then grinned. "What are you making, Miss Margaret?" "Bread," she said with more confidence than she felt. His grin widened. "Mama used to make bread too." Margaret's heart clenched, but she forced a smile. "Then I shall try to do it well for you." When Caleb entered, boots thudding against the floor, the scent of something acrid had already begun to fill the room. Margaret rushed to the stove and pulled out the loaf, but the top was blackened, the crust hard as stone. Her hands shook as she placed it on the table. She bit her lip, bracing herself for a sharp word. Caleb looked at the loaf, then at her flushed face, and said nothing. He only set his hat on the peg and fetched a small bucket of water from the porch. "Warm water," he said simply, placing it by the sink for washing. Margaret blinked at him, startled by his calm. She had expected a sigh, or a frown, or at least a muttered remark. Instead, he gave her a gift, as small and steady as kindness itself. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, and nodded. "Thank you." Later, as she scrubbed the table clean, Thomas picked at the hard crust and laughed when it crumbled into sharp crumbs. "Do not laugh," she said, half ashamed. But he only shook his head. "I like it. It makes a sound like rocks." Margaret stared at him, then burst into a laugh of her own, the sound surprising her as much as it seemed to surprise Caleb, who paused at the doorway and glanced toward them. That night, Margaret sat on the small bed again, her hands folded in her lap. She thought of the burnt bread, of the blackened crust, and of how neither the child nor the father had mocked her. Instead, there had been laughter, warm water, and quiet understanding. Her hands might be clumsy, she thought, but perhaps her heart could still find a place in this silent house. The sky darkened before noon, a wall of clouds rolling over the prairie like a great beast waking from slumber. The air grew heavy, the stillness broken only by the restless shift of the wind against the eaves. Margaret stood at the window of the small house, her hands damp from washing, her heart tightening as the first low growl of thunder shook the air. She had seen storms from her father's porch in Boston, but never anything that carried the weight of the western sky. This was different, vast and fierce, as though the land itself were warning her of its power. Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor, playing with a small wooden horse that bore the marks of years of love. He glanced up as the thunder rumbled again, his brown eyes wide. "Is it going to be bad, Miss Margaret?" he asked. She forced her voice steady, though her own nerves shook. "Storms sound worse than they are sometimes," she said gently, kneeling beside him. Still, when the wind howled against the shutters, and the rain began to lash at the roof like stones, she felt the child tremble. She pulled him into her lap, wrapping her arms around his small frame. The fire in the hearth snapped and hissed, its warmth barely holding back the chill that slipped through the cracks. Thomas buried his face against her shoulder. "Papa usually sings," he whispered, voice muffled. Margaret hesitated, her throat tightening, then hummed a tune she remembered from childhood, one her mother had sung when she was small. The melody was faint, uneven at first, but Thomas stilled in her arms, listening. She began to sing the words softly, her voice trembling at the edges but growing stronger with each line. The storm roared, thunder splitting the air, but inside the little house, her voice wove with the fire's crackle, creating a cocoon of calm. Thomas's breathing slowed, his fists unclenching as he rested more fully against her. His eyelids fluttered as he whispered, "You sound like Mama." The words pierced her heart, but she only pressed her cheek to his hair and kept singing, her voice steady now, carrying through the shadows. Caleb came in from the barn then, rain dripping from his hat, his shoulders tense. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes narrowing against the dim light, then softening as he saw them by the fire. Margaret looked up briefly, startled, but he did not speak. He leaned against the doorframe, his breath heavy from the storm outside, and watched in silence. His son safe, his home warm, and this woman holding it together with nothing more than her arms and a trembling song. When at last the thunder began to fade and the rain eased to a steady patter, Margaret's voice fell quiet. Thomas was asleep, his lashes still damp from earlier tears. She lifted her gaze again and met Caleb's eyes across the room. For a moment neither moved, neither spoke. The silence was thick, yet not empty. It carried a weight she felt in her chest, a recognition she dared not name. Caleb removed his hat slowly and set it aside. "You did well," he said, his voice rough but gentle. Margaret looked down at the child in her arms, her heart beating fast. "I only sang," she whispered. He shook his head. "You steadied him." The words lingered between them as the firelight flickered. warming the room in a way no storm could steal away. The air smelled of fresh dust after the storm, the prairie washed clean beneath a pale blue sky. Margaret carried a basket toward the general store, her boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. She told herself she needed flour and lamp oil, but truthfully, she dreaded the errand. Whispers followed her each time she stepped into town, whispers sharp enough to sting, no matter how high she held her chin. She pushed open the store's door, the bell above giving a tired jingle. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of tobacco and coffee beans. A few townsfolk turned their heads, their eyes skimming her figure before sliding away. She ignored them. Moving toward the shelves, her basket clutched tight against her side. She had just reached for a sack of flour when a familiar voice broke through the room like a blade. Well, if it isn't Margaret Hayes. His first to one, her hand froze midair, her chest tightening. Slowly she turned, her heart dropping as she saw the man leaning casually against the counter. His suit was fine, though travel-stained, his boots polished, his smile too sharp to be kind. Charles Whitcomb. She had known him in Boston, a man who once courted her with honeyed words that turned bitter the moment she refused his empty promises. "Charles," she managed, her voice low. He spread his arms slightly, as though greeting an old friend. "What a sight, finding you here at the edge of nowhere. I heard whispers back east that you'd gone west, chasing hope on the rails. I half thought it a joke." The clerk shifted uncomfortably, pretending to busy himself with stacking jars, but his ears tilted toward them. Margaret steadied herself, gripping the flour sack as though it were a lifeline. "Why are you here?" she asked, keeping her tone flat. Charles smirked, his eyes scanning her with open disdain. "Business, of course. But imagine my surprise to see you, of all people. The belle who never fit the gown, the girl who thought she could outgrow her station. And now, what are you here? A ranch hand stray?" Heat rushed to her cheeks, shame and anger tangled together. She wanted to leave, to walk out and never hear his voice again, but her feet rooted to the floor. Before she could speak, the bell above the door jingled once more. Caleb stepped inside, dust clinging to his boots, his hat low over his eyes. He saw Margaret first, then Charles, and his jaw set like stone. "Something wrong here?" Caleb asked, his voice even but carrying weight. Charles chuckled lightly. "Nothing at all. Just an old acquaintance." He tipped his head toward Margaret, though she's always had a habit of showing up where she doesn't belong. Caleb's eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, placing himself between Margaret and the man in the fine coat. "She belongs with me," he said, his words quiet but unshakable. The store went still, even the clerk pausing mid-stack. Margaret's breath caught in her chest, the words striking deeper than she could bear. Charles's smile faltered, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He adjusted his collar, muttered something about wasted time, and strode out the door, the bell clanging behind him. For a long moment, silence held. Margaret stared at the floor, her hands trembling around the basket. Caleb turned to her, his voice soft now. "You all right?" She nodded faintly, though tears pressed at her eyes. He gave a single nod, then lifted the basket from her hands. "Let's get you home." As they stepped into the sunlight, Margaret felt the sting of the whispers begin to fade, replaced by something steadier, something that held her upright. Caleb had not said the words for show, she realized. He had said them because he meant them. For the first time, she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she truly did belong. The sun slipped low across the prairie, painting the fields in gold, but Margaret felt none of its warmth as she carried a basket of laundry from the line. The fabric smelled of wind and wood smoke, her hands raw from scrubbing, yet there was a quiet pride in the work. Each small task she completed wove her more firmly into the life of the ranch. She had begun to believe she might belong here, if not in name, then at least in spirit. That belief faltered when she passed the open window of the small barn and heard Caleb's voice inside. He was speaking to Reverend Miller, who often came to check on widowers and their children. Margaret paused, her steps stilling on the dirt path. She had not meant to linger, but the sound of her name, caught her breath. "She's been a help," Caleb was saying, his voice steady. "But I don't need another wife. I never asked for one." The words struck Margaret like a stone. Her chest hollowed as though all the air had been pulled from it. She pressed a hand to her mouth, steadying herself, but the world tilted anyway. She wanted to step inside and hear the rest, to give him the chance to explain, yet fear rooted her in place. Reverend Miller murmured something she could not make out. Then Caleb's voice again, quieter but no less sharp. The boy needed someone to read to him, someone to keep the house, but that's all. That's enough. Margaret's heart thudded painfully. That's all. The phrase echoed through her head, sharper than Charles's cruel words in the store, sharper than the whispers she had endured since arriving. She had dared to think she might matter here, not as a guest but as a woman, as herself. Now she saw the truth. She was filling a gap, nothing more. A pair of hands to sweep the floor. A voice to hush a child at night. Not wanted, not chosen, not loved. She turned from the window, her vision blurring as she stumbled back toward the house. Inside, Thomas sat at the table drawing with a stub of charcoal. He looked up at her, his face bright. "Miss Margaret, look, I drew the horse, and Papa says maybe I can ride him soon." She forced a smile, nodding at the picture though she barely saw it. Her throat ached with the effort of keeping her voice even. "That's very fine, Thomas. Very fine indeed." When Caleb entered moments later, wiping dust from his hands, Margaret had already gone to her small room. She closed the door quietly, her back pressed against the wood as her knees weakened. The little space seemed smaller than ever, the air close and heavy. Her carpetbag sat where she had left it, folded neatly beneath the bed. Slowly, with trembling hands, she pulled it out. She packed carefully. Her shawl, her Bible, the few clothes she had brought west. Not everything, only enough to walk away without noise. She folded the blanket that had been given to her and set it at the foot of the bed, smoothing it once with her palm. She paused when she reached the wooden comb left on her nightstand, a gift she had cherished. Her fingers hovered, then lifted it gently, pressing it once to her chest before slipping it into the bag. Thomas's laughter drifted down the hall, light and free, and it cut her more deeply than anger ever could. She sat on the edge of the bed, tears streaking silently down her cheeks. She had thought she was building a place here, that the silence of the house was slowly filling with warmth. But now, she knew better. She was nothing more than borrowed light, and soon the house would forget she had ever been there at all. The night air was sharp with the bite of approaching winter, the sky wide and scattered with stars that offered little warmth. Margaret's bag sat by the door, packed and ready, though her heart trembled with every glance she gave it. She had told herself she would slip away quietly before dawn, before Caleb or Thomas could stop her. Better to leave now than to linger where she was not wanted. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands twisting the strap of her shawl, when the sound of a door creaking open startled her. At first, she thought it was Caleb moving through the house, but the footsteps were too light, too hurried. She rose and stepped into the hallway, her breath catching when she saw the front door swinging open against the night. Thomas's coat was gone from its peg, his boots missing from beneath the bench. Panic surged through her veins. She rushed outside, calling his name into the dark. No answer came, only the moan of the wind against the prairie grass. Her heart raced as she scanned the yard. The barn loomed quiet, the corral empty save for a restless horse shifting in the shadows. She spotted small tracks in the dirt, already blurring under the night wind, leading away from the house. Without thinking, she grabbed the lantern by the porch, lit it with trembling hands, and followed. "Thomas!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Thomas! Come back!" The lantern's glow flickered weakly, casting long, trembling shadows across the field. Her boots sank into the soft earth, her skirts catching on the brush, but she did not slow. Fear pressed harder with every step. She knew why he had gone. The words he must have overheard, the hurt she had not hidden well enough. He thought she would leave him, and he had run into the night rather than lose her. Her lungs burned as she climbed a low ridge, the lantern shaking in her grip. At the crest, she paused, straining to hear past the rush of blood in her ears. Then, Faint and thin, she heard it, a sob, carried on the wind. She stumbled down the slope, nearly falling as the ground gave way beneath her boots. At the bottom she found him, curled against a fallen log, his small shoulders shaking. "Thomas!" she gasped, dropping to her knees beside him. He turned, his face streaked with tears, his little hands clutching the scarf she had begun to knit, but never finished. "You were leaving," he sobbed. "You were going to go, just like Mama." Margaret gathered him into her arms, clutching him tightly. "No, sweetheart, I would never leave you in the dark like this. I was foolish to pack, foolish to think I didn't belong here. But I am here now, and I will not let you go." His tears soaked into her dress, his body trembling against hers. She rocked him gently, whispering over and over that he was safe, that he was loved. The pounding of hooves broke through the night. Caleb appeared at the edge of the lantern light, his face pale with fear, his breath ragged from the ride. He leapt from the saddle, his eyes finding them at once. Relief flooded his features as he dropped to the ground. He pulled them both into his arms, his voice rough. "Thank God. I thought I'd lost you." Margaret looked up at him through tears, Thomas still clinging to her. The boys' sobs quieted as Caleb's arms wrapped around them both, strong and steady. In that circle of warmth, beneath the wide Wyoming sky, Margaret felt something shift, something she had longed for all her life. Not pity, not charity, but family. And though the night was cold, in that moment she had never felt more held. The lantern light flickered low in the small cabin, shadows dancing along the walls, as if the house itself breathed again after the fear of the night. Thomas lay curled beneath a quilt, his lashes still wet from tears, but his breathing was steady now, soft and even. Margaret sat at his bedside, one hand resting on the boy's small fingers, unwilling to let go, though sleep had finally claimed him. Her own heart still pounded from the terror of finding him out in the cold, from the thought of what might have happened if she had been slower. Behind her, the floor creaked. She turned slightly to see Caleb standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands, his face worn with worry. For a moment he only looked at them, his gaze lingering on the boy, and then shifting to her, his eyes heavy with things unsaid. Margaret smoothed the quilt once more, then rose slowly, her knees weak from exhaustion. She stepped into the hallway, leaving the door cracked so the glow of the lantern would keep Thomas from waking in the dark. In the main room, the fire had burned low, filling the cabin with a warm, dim hush. Margaret folded her arms across her chest, bracing herself for whatever he might say. She expected rebuke, a lecture on carelessness, perhaps even the reminder that she was only a guest here, that her presence had led to the night's near disaster. But Caleb did not scold. He set his hat on the table, dragged a hand across his jaw, and exhaled slowly. His voice, when it came, was rough with honesty. "You did not hesitate," he said. "You went after him before I could even saddle my horse. You could have been trampled in the dark or lost in the hills, but you ran anyway. You held him like he was yours." Margaret swallowed hard, her throat aching. "He was out there because of me," she whispered. "He thought I was leaving, and he followed. If anything had happened..." Her words broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Caleb stepped closer, his boots steady against the floorboards. "If anything had happened, we would have faced it together. But you found him. You kept him safe. That matters more than anything." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I heard you say it," she admitted, "to the Reverend, that you didn't need another wife, that I was only here to help. I believed you, and I thought I should go." Caleb's brow furrowed, regret shadowing his face. He shook his head slowly. "I spoke poorly. What I meant is, I wasn't looking. I wasn't ready. My wife's grave is still fresh in my memory, and I feared bringing someone here only to fail them. But I was wrong to let you believe you were nothing more than hands in a quiet house." He paused, his gaze steady on hers. "You've brought life back to this place. You've given Thomas laughter again. You've given me something I thought was gone for good. I don't need another wife, Margaret. I need you." Her breath caught, her heart hammering as the words sank in. He reached for her hand, rough fingers trembling as they wrapped around her own, not out of duty, not out of pity, out of choice. Because you are more than enough. Why and I am. Margaret blinked back tears, her chest rising with a trembling breath. For the first time since she stepped off the train, she felt the ground steady beneath her feet. She squeezed his hand gently, her voice breaking. Then I will stay. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence that followed. Caleb did not speak again, and he did not need to. His hand in hers was promise enough. The morning dawned soft and bright, the kind of day that seemed to belong more to spring than to late autumn. A hush lay over the pine grove at the edge of Caleb's land, broken only by the rustle of needles swaying high above, and the calls of birds darting from branch to branch. Margaret stood beneath the tallest tree, her dress plain but carefully stitched, the cream fabric brushing against her ankles. She had sewn it herself, each seam pulled with shaking fingers at night, and though it was not perfect, she felt no shame wearing it. The pines formed an archway overhead, their scent sharp and sweet, and in the clearing a handful of neighbors gathered quietly, their faces softened with something close to kindness. Thomas darted between the rows of benches Caleb had set up, his laughter carrying through the grove as he scattered wildflowers from a small basket. His cheeks glowed pink, his curls wild, and when he looked up at Margaret, he grinned so wide her heart gave a painful, joyous ache. She bent to straighten the crown of daisies he had plopped on her head, though half the petals already drooped, and kissed his forehead. "Go on, sweetheart," she whispered. "The day is yours too." Caleb stood near the front, his coat brushed clean, his hat in his hands. He looked at her as though the world itself had gone still, his gray eyes steady and unguarded. Margaret walked toward him, her step slow, her heart thudding as every moment of the past weeks seemed to gather in her chest. The laughter, the storms, the quiet evenings by the fire, the words that had finally made her believe she was wanted. When she reached him, he offered his hand, calloused and strong, and she took it without hesitation. Reverend Miller spoke the vows in a low, solemn voice. His words carried on the wind through the branches. Margaret barely heard them, her gaze locked on Caleb's, her fingers trembling in his grasp. When he repeated the words, his voice rough with emotion, she felt the truth in every syllable. When her turn came, she answered with a steadiness that surprised even her. "I do." The neighbors murmured their approval, some smiling, some wiping their eyes. Thomas wriggled between them, tugging at his father's coat until Caleb lifted him into his arms. The boy clutched Margaret's hand too, binding them together as though he understood more than words could hold. The three of them stood beneath the pines, sunlight filtering down in golden beams, and the Reverend declared what they already knew in their hearts: they were a family. Afterward there was no grand feast, only pie shared from tin plates, mugs of cider passed hand to hand, and laughter that rose like music through the trees. Margaret sat with Thomas in her lap, Caleb's arm resting on the back of her chair, and for the first time she felt no weight of shame pressing her down. She was not too much, not too little, not borrowed or temporary. She was home. If this story warmed your heart, do not forget to subscribe to Western Love Legends, and be sure to like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support keeps these frontier romances alive, where love rises from dust and storms to prove itself stronger than hardship. And remember, even if the bread burns and the chair wobbles, there is always someone out there who will still want to marry you under the pines.